Hi friends, my name is Borrodante and welcome back to the drawing to painting tutorial. So, we're done with shading the t-shirt the basic way. Now let's move on to the skin to see how to deal with that. Because skin has this awkward effect called translucency that requires a certain special approach for its shading. So we learned that from the main defined color, the brightest color of this light source, we go darker and darker, vertically like this, and when we get dark enough to meet the brightness of the darkest color of this object, we start to blend the color of the object with this dark color of the air perspective. And that's how we get the darkest shadows. Now, skin is obviously really close to that, but with one extra thing. Instead of just getting darker, translucent objects will also get a bit more saturated. And that's because the light will penetrate the surface of this material and collect more of the color of this material before leaving it from somewhere else. Meaning, if light hits at this place, then it starts to randomly going all over the place because it diffuses a lot when it's inside of a translucent object. And it will be collecting the color of the object. So that's why we literally just get darker and also increase the saturation. And that's why we get this kind of color for the translucency of the skin. Now, a thing to remember though, skin is only one thing that's being translucent in a human body. Under the skin there's blood, which makes the whole translucent color also red. It's a bit more complex, so let's imagine for now, to make it a bit more simple, that this zombie also have this greenish kind of color of their meat and blood. Like, he's all kind of rotten inside, that's why he's all the way slightly green. So, basically, if the object is kind of evenly colored inside of it, meaning we are not evenly colored inside, we have this pinkish, yellowish colored skin, and underneath there's red meat and blood. Blood, really, meat itself is not red. But the blood becomes red, that's why our ears get really red when they're being lit through. And fingers as well. But what's interesting, a finger at this area would be red, but at the very edge it will get yellowish. That's because at that place there won't be any blood left, there will be only skin that's being translucent. So that's what creates this rich gradient of translucency of human body. On the very edge it's yellow, and as it goes deeper and deeper, it gets more and more red. So we have kind of a waxy zombie right now. So, aside from that, all the logic is the same. It's just that as we get darker and darker, we get more and more saturated. But don't overdo it, it's not crazy. It's just, if you do it too little, it will look a bit too cold and kind of dirty shading for skin. It doesn't look very correctly if you don't make it more saturated. So there we go, this part, like the forearm, is pointing forward a lot, so all of its surface is not gonna be facing the camera all that much, so it's all facing away a lot. Therefore, not a single part of the forearm will be very bright. And here we have the sides of the bicep. Bicep is round on the edges, so it will also get darker. Now, to make it clear, this is actually a pretty common type of shading when it's like getting brighter as it's facing us. Just to demonstrate, let's light up this forearm as if it's being lit from the top, so you would get the logic of how to work with this kind of stuff in general, how to work with the light. Although, again, this kind of thing is mostly about doing studies from photos to understand how exactly the light works. But just to apply the logic that we already defined here. So the light source is from the top on this particular part. It's gonna look so weird when we finish this, but at first I'll define the terminator. So the terminator, let's go with a darker color. Like a metal color will be the edge of the terminator. Again, the terminator is where the surface bends away from the light at all. Like after this part, all of this from the bottom will be completely not lit, but it's gonna have a different color, so there's no point of filling it up. So at first we just define this edge everywhere. So I assume somewhat like this. This whole part will catch some light. This top part of the finger will also catch some of that. And kind of like this. Pay attention to all the tiniest parts of everything. All the fingers matter. And all this bottom stuff will be in the shadow. Now, the very shadowest part, let's imagine that there's no light source, no reflected light from the bottom at all. That means actual black, since there's no other color, no other light. So we grab the air perspective color and literally fill in all the darkness at the bottom. Like this, right after the edge of the Terminator. That's it, there's no light being caught on the surface of the hand from the top light source. So we have kind of really dramatic, high contrast kind of lighting here. This is the kind of lighting that we would have if this arm would be floating in space, because there would be light from the sun on one side, but absolutely nothing to reflect that sunlight from the other side. In reality, that almost never happens on this planet, because there's always something around us that will reflect the light from the other side. Even just air, the atmosphere, the blue sky, you know? There's always light from everywhere. So we do this, so we filled in the areas where we don't have to think about the shading from this top light source at all. This is it, only the bright area is where we have some work to do with the shading. So now we grab this color, or let's actually grab the color of the skin, the brightest one, and just go darker like this. Darker and more saturated. Again, going with smooth, big strokes to define basic round shapes of everything. And this part is all facing away to the side, so there will be no bright parts at all. And even darker, so instead of going vertically like this, we choose our angle. And the more translucent, the more vibrant the material is, that's up to you to decide how much it is, the stronger this angle will be. But never go too strong, because it starts to look really weird. So just add a little bit of extra saturation for the shading. You see, it looks very alive, like it really feels like a proper shading for something that's flashy. But a t-shirt wouldn't need that at all. It looks fine as it is, without any extra saturation for the shadows. So after defining a dark enough color of the translucency, we start to really blend that saturated color with the air perspective color to, you know, show a bit of a smooth transition into the darkness. Toning down some contrasts on the top, because there wouldn't be that much of a difference in the brightness on the top details. So here's a very sharp, perfect light from just one light source, if it's from the top. Now again, this would never happen in reality, so let's add some secondary lighting from the bottom. Secondary lighting means it will be reflected from the floor, from the pants, from the shirts. The nearest object is the shirt and probably floor, because even though it's further away, it's a lot bigger. It's a big surface that lights up all the character from the bottom. Now let's imagine that the floor is kind of a warm color, like wood. So that means that the light is being white from the top. That's why it lights up our skin with this color. But when this white light will hit the floor, it will collect its warm color, the warm color of the wood, and gets reflected to the top, back to the character from the bottom, and it will be already a lot more of a warm color. So it will get a lot darker. So we get the skin color, we make it a lot darker, and then we blend in the color of the wood. So closer to red and a lot more saturated. No actual light source is as saturated as a reflected light because it collects colors of all the surfaces around. So that's why it gets more interesting that way. So a lot darker because when the light gets reflected, it loses a lot of its energy. Yet a lot more saturated and more interesting. So there we imagine the opposite direction of light, meaning this is the light that's being reflected from the bottom, from the wooden floor. And basically all the same logic applies to the reflected light, except for the fact that reflected light is really soft. If sun or a flashlight or any kind of light bulb creating the light, that's a very pointy, tiny light source. And floor is super huge, it has a huge surface. That means the lighting from it will be very soft. We won't see any sharp shadows, and the whole values thing will be a lot softer. At a certain point, it will be like almost not noticeable at all. And this is really important to nail it right. Never make the shading from the reflected light too sharp. So you see, I don't really define all that much of geometry, I get everything really soft. Just a tiny hints of the geometry and that's it. So at certain points it really gets to just the definition of ambient occlusion. That's the shadows from indirect light, which is almost what the reflected light is. When it's really diffused, going all over the place, it almost doesn't have any direction. In general, most of the shadows that will appear here will be not from the angle, like how much the surface of the hand faces away from the floor, but more of how close the fingers are next to each other, because when they're really close, this diffused light won't be able to get inside of it. And because of that, we'll have this soft ambient occlusion shadows. Shadows of the depth, sort of. So a little bit in here, because between the thumb and the index finger, there's a small space, and that's why they get a bit shaded by each other. And the top part of these fingers, because there's no light from the top and they're facing away from the floor completely, so no light for them as well. So you see, it looks so much more realistic right now, because the eye really recognizes the direct bright light from the top and very soft, very dim, and very indirect light from the bottom. Thanks to the fact that we didn't define all that much of geometry, all that much of differences in the values with this secondary light, we made it really, really soft. Okay, one more thing to define about the whole skin shading. Let's add a little bit of red to actually explain how the whole translucency of real human flesh works. So, before we went darker like this and added some saturation. And that was good enough for just the skin translucency. But at a certain point, like when we get this dark, you kind of have to think, it's again up to you, when the light will be penetrating the surface deep enough to reveal some deeper colors of the blood. Usually that happens when it gets a lot darker, when it gets through a bigger distance of the flesh. So usually it's a good idea to do that on the very edge of the Terminator. So we grab this color, we see it gets darker and under this angle. So it gets from here, from the brightest skin color, to here. Darker and more saturated. To add some blood to that, we just filter out a bit more of yellow and everything, revealing some red skin color. A little bit, not too much, it's not gonna be just pure blood. And so at certain point, it will start becoming a bit more reddish. You see, it immediately receives some healthier skin color. It's not gonna look even close to actually healthy skin because we started with green on the main surface of the skin, but that's basically the same curve you should do. You should just start not with dirt yellow, but with pink kind of color. Not pink, but peach color, right? This is a lot of stuff to just experiment with, to find your right balance to make the colors work just perfectly. So there, now let's add some highlights. I mentioned this more than once in the history of this channel, but this is the rendering tutorial, so we'll go through this again. The highlight will have nothing to do with the color of the object at all. What highlight is is a pure reflection of the light source. If the skin is blue but the light source is white, the highlight will be just white. If the skin is red but the light source is white, the highlight will still be just white. It can just get very subtle, very transparent, so it will be like very subtle layer of this white, but again it will be just white. What I mean by that basically we get the color of the object and we make it not brighter like this, which is what the color of the surface would be if it would be lit more brightly. We don't do that, we get the color of the surface and blend it with pure white. We go not vertically, but closer to this white corner. And the closer we get, the stronger the highlight will be. And here you can see I make just one stroke and it looks not like some bump on the surface, it looks like a highlight. Because it's paler and brighter at the same time. That's what highlight looks like. And again, to find a proper placement and proper shapes for the highlights, do some studies on reflective, wet surfaces or something like that. Moisty bodies or something, I don't know, all kinds of weird stuff you can do studies on. One thing I can tell you for sure, it's so easy to overdo highlights. Like, I already do this. This is probably not a place where the highlight would be. The placement of the highlight depends on where our eyes are. So it's not really where the surface is facing, it's more of where is the surface facing the angle that would reflect the light source to us. What I'm trying to say is, if this is the arm, like if we cut the arm like this and look at it from the side, the brightest part of the surface will be here. And everything else will get darker and darker and darker, up until the Terminator when it gets completely dark and only receives some reflected light. The highlight as a reflection will work this way. If the camera is here and the light source is literally here, then we should find an angle that would reflect a ray coming from the light source right into our eyeball. So it's going to be here, contrary to the brightest spot of the surface, that has nothing to do with where our eyes are. This is the difference between object being lit and object reflecting something. So these are two physically completely different things. The color of the surface and the highlight of the surface. So this part probably won't actually reflect the light source. This one will, and here I can imagine something facing at this angle. But this part will be facing somewhere there when the light source is actually there. And it actually matters. If I would add highlights all over the place, it would start to look kind of flat and lame. So really, it's kind of really important to not do too much of highlights. So that's the thing. It's really, a lot of the times, it's more than enough to just define a couple of nice spots in just one place. And that's it. Okay, so I think this is it for today. Try to process whatever I said right now. I hope all of this was clear enough. Ask your questions if something else you want me to cover. So yeah, a bit more stuff to cover in the next episode, and that would be it for the whole drawing to painting theory that I have today. So yeah. Thanks for watching if you did, I guess you did if you're here. Leave a like and subscribe, tell a friend, do the goddamn studies, do whatever you want, and I will see you in the next one. Bye! Alright, we should also cover adding the second light source from the window. So that will also be a pretty important part of the next episode of this. Funny blooper moment!